And again, it's not human nature. Joshua Goldstein, who writes the textbook I use in my international political economy class, makes a point that I think is well established. He says, complex behaviors such as aggression and war cannot be said to be biologically driven or predetermined, because humanity's most striking biological capacity is flexibility. More than any other species, our behavior, our attitudes, what we do depends on our circumstances, our environment, our experience, and so on. We're much less driven by automatic responses than other animals. Most of our thoughts and actions are in fact unconscious, and we need to take those into account somehow in looking at this problem. It's also, I think, a common mistake along those lines to think that our most personal thoughts and feelings and attitudes and temperaments are just a biological given. This is just the way we are. Again, evidence seems to be growing that our very sense of self, how we think about ourselves, are almost, in some ways, almost our consciousness itself is determined by our experiences, and not just in childhood. I mean, obviously, I'll talk in a minute about the obvious things in terms of popular culture, advertising, the media, and so on. It's not just childhood, even, that can set how we feel and our basic understanding of the world. It can be even experiences in the womb, and this is a brand new field called epigenetics. Experiences that our parents or grandparents went through can be not genetically transmitted to the children, but they can be physically passed on. Not in the DNA itself, because that's more or less immutable, but in the chemicals around the DNA, which can be switched, which can be changed to switch genes off and on, and that can be passed from one generation to the next in terms of emotional and physical well-being. It just reminds us of how interconnected we all are, not in any mystical sense, but in a real down-to-earth biological sense. Robert Sapolsky, who's a neurobiologist at Stanford, talks about, and he made this really good point. He's talking about a gene that's been associated with depression. Now, this could apply to any sort of human behavior or feeling. And what Sapolsky says is, these genes, for example, will only cause depression in certain environments. Our ability to be aggressive, to be unsympathetic for other people, to carry out war crimes, is something we have as a potential, but it will only be activated in certain environments and under certain conditions. And again, this is, I think, a really basic point to keep in mind. As human beings, because of our flexibility, we can be angels or demons. It's not that that our DNA says we are going to act in a certain way. Everything is flexible, and this is a point that Marx was always making. People construct history under conditions not of their own choosing, but we do have our own input into it. We do have an effect. We could decide to end war. We could decide to end poverty if enough of us take that seriously, think about it, and act above all. It's not something that is inevitable part of the human condition or part of human nature. In fact, one of the things we are hardwired to do apparently is to feel compassion for other people. There was a study out of, I think it was New York University, which said that in a person who's not a psychopath, and we'll come back to that in a minute, if you even contemplate hurting somebody else, there's part of your brain that reacts and makes you feel bad before you've even done it. That's a healthy, normal reaction. Frans de Waal, who's one of the most recognized authorities in studying other primates, has just written a book called The Age of Empathy, which says, again, empathy is a natural reaction. It's rooted in a mother's need to understand and be compassionate towards a baby. It's not just in human beings. It's certainly in other primates and even some other mammals as well. But under normal circumstances, we're not driven to hurt other people or to be inconsiderate of other people. But parenting styles make a huge difference in the way whether we can be empathetic and cooperative with other people. George Lakoff, the neuroscientist from Berkeley, has talked about the difference between the harsh, traditional, strict father model, very authoritarian, very patriarchal, versus a nurturing parent model, very egalitarian, very respectful of everybody, and says basically, that the more you are treated with respect as a child, the more your natural empathy and respect for other people will be manifest, and the less likely you are to mindlessly obey orders. In fact, he says that people growing, again, this is a generalization, because there's always exceptions, But people growing up in strict patriarchal families tend to have a moral view that being ethical means following orders and obedience, whereas people growing up in a more nurturing family, one that's more loving and respectful, have empathy as their central moral standard. Harsh childhoods, poverty, racism, all of these things, of course, can tend to make some people more, angrier, frustrated. This is one thing the Nazis, of course, relied on, and Wilhelm Reich talks about that. It's probably the earliest analysis of how if you have people who are running around angry, frustrated, their lives are meaningless, they have very little influence in their, over what's happening, with very little self-determination, and they're looking for an answer. And here comes somebody, it's Muslims, it's Jews, it's communists, whatever. And people will tend to accept that because they're desperately looking for some way to cope with these feelings. Having said all that, again, the ultimate determinant of how we act and behave and think, again, is not necessarily even our individual experiences, although that's a very important factor. Human behavior is also shaped by the situations we find ourselves in. And the situations we find ourselves in ultimately are shaped by systems of power and domination. Now, this was actually quite a revelation to me when I read Philip Zimbardo's latest book. Philip Zimbardo was famous for the Stanford prison experiment in the early 70s when he took some undergrads at Stanford and he put some of them in the position of guards and some in the positions of prisoners and wanted to see what would happen. And he had to stop the experiment fairly quickly because the guards who were normal and not sadistic became sadistic and brutal and unfeeling. And the people who were prisoners were traumatized, became very passive. And, obviously it would have been unethical to continue. And the main thing, again, he says he learned from that, and I think social psychology has shown a lot of truth to this, is that situations matter even more than individual disposition, which is why you will find people carrying out, whether we're talking about genocide in Europe or in Rwanda or in Bosnia or American pilots dropping bombs on Vietnamese or whatever, that those are essentially normal people doing things that they would never have thought they would have done under other circumstances. And the point that a number of people who have studied genocide and war crimes argue is that it's a mistake to think there's them and us. Other people could do horrific things and we never would. Now, there may be some truth to that, and all of these things, I don't want to overstress the point. But studies seem to show that it's normal people getting caught up in abnormal situations. And who constructs these situations? Again, systems of power. It's governments, it's corporations, it's economic systems that put people in combat, for instance. You can't get enough people in the U.S. to volunteer for the military unless they were one way or another manipulated or coerced into it. The best way to do that is to make sure there's an underclass. There's not forced conscription in the sense of having a draft like they used to have, but there's the economic draft. Desperate people, like that woman, I forget her name offhand, who was captured by the Iraqis in the beginning of the war, and then she was rescued by American troops from a hospital where she was being taken well care of. Sorry?
Jessica Lynch.
Thanks, Jessica Lynch, that's who it was. She was from a very poor family, and she joined the military, like many did, because it was the only chance to get an education and to make something of her life. But again, it goes to the point that situations force people, the media, to the extent that after 9/11, convinced the majority of Americans, that Saddam Hussein was behind September 11th, that terrorists are out to get everybody, that the only possible response was to start a war. One of the people who got caught up in that was a guy named Tillman. He was a star player in the National Football League, but he also had a sense of community and a sense of duty, very honorable feelings, and he believed all that, and he went off to war. Later on, as he began to think about it, and he began to read Chomsky amongst others, he realized that he had been duped. And then, it hasn't quite been explained, while he was in Afghanistan, he was killed by friendly fire from about 10 feet away. They said it was an accident, and they really weren't sure how it happened. But he had been planning to quit the army and come back and work against the war.